So America was an amazing place. But then what happened to it? How do we get to the point where we are now? Find the answer to this and more on today's podcast. Hello folks, and welcome back to the podcast. This is episode 4, and today we're going to talk about, so last week we talked about what made the U.S. so great, why the U.S. is so special and so well put together. Today we're going to talk about, unfortunately, the other side of the coin, which is what happened to the U.S. Why did the U.S. break down and get to the point where we are now? So, after World War II, the U.S. was really the top superpower in the world. Yeah, the Soviet Union was there. It was definitely a contender for a while, but it never really got to the same level. And then, since that point, the U.S. has kind of really come down to the point where it is today, which is a very, very sorry shell of what it used to be. So what happened? Well, the first thing is that, as we spoke about last week, one of the great things about the U.S. is that it was an open country. It was nothing had been here before. When the founders got here and they kind of built a new country from scratch, there was no civilization here, which means that there were no controlling mafias. And that's really one of the things that made America great. But guess what? As time goes on, and now it's 250 years into the American experiment, as time goes on, mafias do form, right? You start to get people that start to become rich, and they become really wealthy, then they start to talk to other wealthy people, they start to consolidate power, and after a couple of centuries, maybe a little more than that, you start to have these mafias that start to form. And then eventually you get to the point where these other countries are at, where the country's controlled by mafias. So nowadays we have names like the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Kennedys, the Clintons, the Bushes, and so on and so forth. These are families that are now becoming dynasties, right? Similar to the dynasties in Europe. And so we're kind of headed in that direction. So that's the first thing that just kind of naturally happens. And of course we have to be on guard against that if the American experiment is to succeed in the long term. So the second thing that happened is, because the U.S. was the number one sort of, heavyweight champ, so to speak, everyone wants a shot at the heavyweight champ, right? The minute you're number one at the top, you just put a target on your back, right? And everybody wants to challenge you. And so this is what happened. But since nobody could defeat the U.S. militarily after World War II, really, they had to look for other avenues. And of course there was the nuclear avenue, but nobody, a nuclear war is such a disaster that no one can count on actually winning a nuclear war. So they had to look for another alternative. And so the alternative, I believe, that they looked for was to attack the soft underbelly of the U.S., which was its culture. Right? The U.S., of course, is a very open, very free society, which means anyone can come in here. So this is a soft underbelly. We allow people to come in, and if those people can somehow start trouble here within the U.S., then they've gotten much farther than they would have with their army, right? With the army, they can't even penetrate the U.S., but this way they could much more easily penetrate it. So what happened? How did this manifest itself in the real world? Well, if you look at the generation of the 1960s, what happened in the 1960s? The children were torn away from their parents. The society was completely divided. A new value system, a new completely un-American value system took hold, which was basically the sex, drugs, and rock and roll value system of the 1960s, right? Where all of a sudden you don't have to get married, you don't have to have families, you can just have free sex everywhere, you can take drugs. It doesn't matter. It's all just about having fun, having a good time. So really, it's about two things, hedonism and narcissism. So hedonism is when people just want to please themselves. Narcissism is when you fall in love with yourself and everything, the whole world is just about you. So it really became about this, and of course we're seeing this nowadays. And social media and the internet have made it much worse. So what it did effectively was it put the children at great odds with their parents. It would cause a massive conflict and a massive division in U.S. society. But what that does is it cuts the children off from their past. So it's like when you cut a tree off from its roots, the tree eventually dies. A tree that is cut off from its roots is now very weak. Similarly, the generation of the 60s became very weak once they were cut off from their parents because they didn't know what had gotten them to this point. They didn't know where they came from, what made their civilization great, what was responsible for their successes, what are those values that they needed to continue to follow, to move forward, and continue to have the U.S. be strong and successful. So all of that was taken away. And so what was this new value system? So the bulk of this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to go through 11 points where this value system differed completely from the traditional American value system. And you're going to see very clearly how this was responsible for our decline. So the first of these points is that America used to be a very logical place, right? It was very meritocratic. You went out on the street, you did your thing. If you didn't succeed, you just kept trying, you just kept going and plugging away at it until eventually you made it. So it was a very rational, very disciplined, very determined, tenacious type of attitude. This was replaced by emotions, right? Preponderance of emotions. You have to feel good. You do what feels good. If it feels good, do it, right? It turned into that. And so, of course, one of the principles like free speech, which is, again, based on thought, logic, discipline, knowing that, hey, people need to have free speech if ideas are eventually going to come to the fold and compete, and the best idea wins. So this was taken away, and it was replaced by political correctness, right? Which really is one of those bullshit buzzwords, and all it means is restricted speech. All it means is we tell you what to say. We tell you what it's okay to say, and the other things you can't even talk about. So now, what was the main tenet of political correctness? Well, it was that you couldn't offend anyone. Now, in America prior to this, people got offended all the time. There was multiracial society. There was a lot of racism. There was a lot of racial slurs. People were constantly insulting each other, but they became kind of tough and immune to those things, and they kept plugging away anyways. Well, now this completely changed. Now, being offended became a badge of honor instead of a badge of shame. Before, if you were offended, it's like, hey, get over it. Just keep going. Keep doing your thing. Now it became, no, the world stops because you became offended. And once this was implemented really in society, then of course being offended just exploded because it was rewarded, right? The minute you say I'm offended, that's it. Everybody had to stop, and nobody could say, even if the attacks were true, all you had to say was, hey, I'm offended, and that's it. Boom, that's it. Discussion's over, right? And this is another point of logic versus emotions. Debate was completely discouraged. All you had to say is, I'm offended, that's it, debate's over, right? And so when I was in school, we were taught to debate. We were put in the same room with people from the other side of the political spectrum, right, left, whatever you want to call it. And so it was a very uncomfortable lesson, but we all learned it, that you had to talk to people who didn't think like you, and you had to somehow find a way to communicate and bridge the differences. All of this went away. And as I spoke in a prior episode, this is now what started to really divide us. Because now instead of bridging our differences, now I'm sit over here, you sit over there. We never resolve the differences, and we just start lobbing bombs at each other until eventually it turns into violence. So, independent thought, right? Americans were known for their independent thinking, breaking all these barriers and saying and doing all these things that people thought were anathema, but in reality weren't. So this type of independent thought then became conspiracy theories, right? And now this term is much newer than the 1960s, but if you look at what it is, as I mentioned in a prior episode, it is a form of peer pressure. They don't actually attack the idea. They just say, hey, that idea is bad. You know why? Because not many people believe in it. It's a conspiracy theory. There's a few wackos that believe in it, and so you shouldn't believe in it either. Well, that's called peer pressure. Okay, that's called emotions. That's not logic. So again, the culture drifted towards emotions as opposed to logic. And finally, They spoke a lot about love in the 1960s. Love, love, love. Everything was about love. The reality is that all that talk about love was actually a mask for all the hatred that they were introducing. Because really, as we now know, this new culture that came about was completely mired in hatred. So what do I mean? Well, hatred of your parents, of tradition, of religion, of your country, of family, of not only your family, but the concept of a family, of money as a concept, right? And we start drifting towards things like communism, which we'll talk about in a minute, and also hatred of the opposite sex. Now, what do I mean? You're going to say, well, wait a minute, what do you mean by that? Well, it used to be that the opposite sexes used to respect each other. But after this, we started to have something called the battle of the sexes, where sexes started to compete, doing the same thing. Instead of working as a team, which we'll talk about in a minute as well, they started to compete, and men wanted to be like women wanted to be like men, and it just turned into this big battle. And so we were taught, and up until today, there is this disdain for the opposite sex, and that's because we don't really understand the two different roles, how they must be different because they complement each other. We'll talk about that, more about that in a minute. So that's the first point out of the 11, logic versus emotions. You can see how we definitely drifted towards emotions. The second point out of the 11, merit was replaced by equality of outcome. Right? So it used to be that in America, if you didn't do something good, if you didn't succeed, then nobody would even hear about you. You succeeded, you had merit, you brought it, a good idea, a good product, whatever it was, you solved people's problems, that was a big deal. So now it all became about not merit, but now everyone had to be praised and everyone had to be treated equally. Okay, regardless of what they did. So what am I talking about here? Well, things like socialism and communism, Americans started to romance about these things. In spite of the failures, the abject, massive, disastrous failures that they were everywhere else, people started romancing about it. I'm talking about how, no, it could really work. And we'll talk more about that in later, but they started romancing about this. And it's because these systems also deal with the equality of outcome as opposed to merit. So what about the concept of everyone gets a trophy or participation awards that we have nowadays? So, many people have complained, like, for example, little leagues where kids play soccer or whatever. Everyone gets a participation award. Everyone's a winner. Now, winning and losing doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how good you do something. Everyone gets an award. And so, obviously, doing something good, doing something better than somebody else is hard work. You're not going to be incentivized to do that anymore. So the whole standard is going to fall drastically when you do something, when you push something like equality of outcome. So what it does is it kills excellence, and that's the problem with it. Nature demands excellence. Okay, if you look at just the animal kingdom, it's survival of the fittest. So what's that about? It's excellence, right? Whether it's physical excellence or strategic, whatever it might be, if you lose the battle, you die and you disappear. And so this is nature, and we are sort of moving away from nature. As I said in a prior episode, humans are moving away from the animal kingdom into civilization, but excellence is still very much a part of this, and we see it in the real world. If you don't solve problems in your life, the problems just keep mounting and mounting until things become a disaster. So if you look at a place like Cuba, everybody's starving, even though it's a good piece of land, it's fertile, everything's fine, but because you have this system of equality of outcome, everyone is starving because nobody's actually going to go out and produce because there's no incentive. So that's the second point, merit versus equality of outcome. The third, our self-respect and pride as a nation was replaced by shame, and it was done so unjustifiably, inaccurately, okay? Because what they did is they rewrote history to refocus it on only the bad things that happened in the U.S., like slavery, right? And then the other point, the other side of this coin, is that while we're focusing on all the evil that happened in the U.S., we don't focus on the rest of the world. Now, America had always kind of been like that. It was isolationist, and They were breaking away from the rest of the world, so they really didn't care about learning too much about the other countries. This continued. So what ended up happening is you have a student who grows up learning about all the evils that happen in the U.S. and nothing about any other country. So now when they start looking at other countries, they look at it with these very naive eyes that don't know anything. And they start thinking, oh, well, yeah, other countries are better than the U.S. because, look, this whole pile of evil that I learned about, I didn't hear any of this evil in the other countries. Now, little do they know that the evil that happened in the U.S., it was 10 or 100 times worse in the other countries. Okay, but of course they don't know that. And so they start romanticizing with all these foreign ideas and foreign systems, and this is what happened. So America became a place of shame, a place that, it was an evil country, and it needed to be destroyed. And of course, this is what our enemies want. They want it to come in, attack us, and have us destroy it from within. So that's point number 3, self-respect versus shame. The fourth one, clarity versus confusion. So things in the U.S., if you look back in the 1950s, things were very clear. Things were very structured, right? Too much structured, as it turned out, right? Because, sometimes you have creativity that tries to break structure, and you got to be a little bit flexible. But what happened was they went all the way to the other end of the spectrum. And the way they were able to sow so much confusion in our society, I'm going to describe in a moment. You might be thinking, well, what's so confusing about our life today? Well, kids don't even know what gender they are, okay? We don't know what the role of men is, what the role of women is, what our genders are. Everything is just completely confused. I mean, if you don't know what gender you are, what do you know, really? So that's just an example to show you how confused we are. Now, how did we get here? Well, what they did is they started by saying, you know what? We need to hear more opinions, which on the face is a good thing, right? At face value. So they started bringing in all these diversity of opinions, but here was the trick. When you start listening to other opinions, the whole point is you got to listen to other opinions and then incorporate it into your way of thinking. And that way it enriches you and you come up with a better solution that's better, more resilient, whatever it might be. Well, they never did this. They just allowed all these ideas to come in and they never resolved anything. So for those who remember the Jerry Springer show in the 1980s, I believe it was in the 80s, this is a show where they would bring people and they would have a lot of conflicts on the show. People would start fighting, literally fighting, throwing chairs on live television and punching each other and whatever. And at the very end of the show, Jerry Springer would say, you know what? We're not here to solve these problems. We're just here to show the different sides of an issue. And this was a common theme throughout many, many political talk shows and other types of talk shows, like news shows and all that, where they said, we're not here to solve anything. We're just here to show all the different sides. So what does that cause? It causes confusion. The whole point of looking at all the sides is that you resolve them eventually, and you come up with a really good solution that incorporates all sides. But they never did that. So that's how it started. That's how confusion kind of got in the door. And then what they did, of course, is lots of propaganda, especially coming out of the government, but also everywhere else, right? I mean, corporate America has what we nowadays call marketing. Okay, it's propaganda, right? It's lies. But if we just look for a moment at the government, at what they did, you can see that it was more than just, a few businesses trying to make money. If you look at many of the initiatives that came about in the 20th century, when government really started to balloon and become much bigger, you have Social Security, right? It's named Social Security, which means, oh, I feel secure because my retirement is now secure. In reality, it means the government controls your retirement, right? You pay into the government, and then 50 years later, after they've inflated the hell out of the dollar, and maybe if it's not broke, you might get some money back, right? So now people get these tiny checks that don't support them, right? And that was called Social Security. Globalism, that was a euphemism for let's weaken the U.S. Let's make the U.S. a lot weaker, and let's focus on problems of other countries and making them richer. And so we exported industries, jobs, whatever. And this was called globalization and free trade, right? It was really a euphemism for weakening the U.S. Okay, so if we remember NAFTA, that was a big controversy. And of course, we saw that after NAFTA, we lost many industries. And now we're at the point today where we have a lot of economic problems. When I got to this country, there was no such problem. This place was extremely strong. And this is what these people have done over the last 50 years. The euphemisms or the buzzwords of socialism and communism, they're just euphemisms for tyranny and poverty. And we'll talk more about that probably in a later episode. But that's all they are. You don't believe me? Just go look at Venezuela and Cuba and places like that. And finally, I'll mention one more: DEI and identity politics. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is not about diversity, equity, or inclusion. Okay? What this is all about is, let's focus on what divides us. Let's focus on our race, on our culture, on the things that divide us, as opposed to the things that we have in common, and how different people can come together and work together anyway, in spite of their differences, and come up with something great. No, now we're going to focus on the differences only. So really what this is doing is it was promoting division, discrimination, racism, all of that. And we see that now, in the last 15 or 20 years, this problem has become worse. And it's because they're focusing on it. They're deliberately trying to bring it back. Okay, it was never fully gone, I agree, but they were bringing it back. They're actually making it worse. They're moving in the wrong direction. So all these things were a form of propaganda. They were named one thing, and they really mean something else. And so this just caused even more confusion in our popular culture. And finally, the final point of confusion is that the press, what we call the press nowadays, is no longer a press. The press is a propaganda outlet. Okay, it is completely agenda driven. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I saw this from the moment I moved to the U.S. because I came from Israel. We actually went from Israel to Spain to the U.S., but I had recently lived in Israel. And when I saw what was being reported in the U.S. regarding Israel, and I compared it to my reality in Israel, I couldn't believe they were talking about the same place. It was a complete fabrication. Okay? It wasn't that they made mistakes. It wasn't that, they didn't quite understand. No, it was a fabrication. And we'll talk more about the Middle East in a later episode. But if you listen to the news and you think you know what's going on in the Middle East, you have no idea. None. Okay, so we'll talk about that later. So again, more confusion. So that was point number 4, right? Clarity versus confusion. Point number 5, America used to be a very independent nation, self-reliant, and now we became more controlled by the government. What am I talking about? Well, let's just run down the list of the 20th century accomplishments of the government. We have the Federal Reserve, income tax, Social Security, FDIC, a bunch of unelected policy think tanks. Some of these are famous in the conspiracy theory world, as they call it. Council of Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission. These are very influential bodies that were really not elected. They were mysterious, yet they influenced policy tremendously. Okay, and what else do we have? We had Obamacare. We have the Green New Deal, right? And now the latest one that they're talking about but hasn't been implemented yet is universal basic income, right? So all of these represent more and more government control, right? So the Federal Reserve, for example, one of the things they did is it took the U.S. off of money that was backed by something, and they turned it into like a fiat currency, which is basically just paper money. And you have to trust the government that the money's worth what they say it's worth, right? That, along with many other issues, as we know now, they control the interest rates and they have a great influence over the economy. And this is not a free market principle. This is just something they came up with. Income tax, not a lot of people know that. Before 1913, we had no income tax. Now we do. We pay dearly. Social Security, we've talked about what that means. A couple more of these. Obamacare was, now your health care is controlled by the government. Okay? So again, you can just see how the government keeps encroaching. The Green New Deal, now they're even talking about what you do, what you buy, You should buy this. You shouldn't buy that. We're going to penalize you for this, reward you for that. So now your behaviors, your everyday behaviors are being controlled by the government. And finally, universal basic income. That, folks, is the final nail in the coffin. If you give the government control over your income, you're finished. This is what happened. We saw this happen in Cuba. It's a scam. They start by giving you a decent check, and you don't have to work. So you say, oh, great idea. Then they start to either inflate the money or reduce your check. And now you don't have a skill. You can't find another job. There's no way out. Now you just got to take it. They're going to decrease. They're going to take you all the way down to poverty level and beyond, which is what happened in Cuba. To my own family, so this is, I'm not reading this anywhere. This is stuff I heard from people that came from Cuba. People that were getting 3 eggs a month. Okay? This is where you end up with universal basic income. So we're going to end up completely tyrannized by government. And the U.S. was the opposite of that. So that's point number 5. Point number 6 out of 11, okay? Purity versus morbidity. If you watch black and white shows from the 1950s, TV shows, sitcoms or whatever, nowadays we laugh at them because they were so wholesome, so like simple and pure and so innocent, and we actually laugh at that. Well, folks, you know, what's wrong with innocence? What's wrong with simplicity and purity and clarity? Nothing. And yet we've been trained to laugh at that and say, that's ridiculous. That's not real life. Life is a piece of crap. Life is morbid. Life is nasty. That's what we've been taught. Think about that for a moment. Just let that sink in. Okay? We value morbidity. Our movies, our TV shows, constantly, news even, constantly pushes the envelope. The news, they look for the most morbid things that happen and they just show them to you day after day, to the point where many people now say, hey, you know what, I don't watch the news anymore, and I'm a lot happier for it because all they show you is crap. Well, why do they show you just crap? Why don't they show you what's actually happening? You know, good things happen too, not just bad things. So we see that, right? We see that constant emphasis on morbidity, but here's where it really gets interesting. In our culture, morbidity became a badge of honor. Now, what do I mean by this? How many people do you know say, oh, you know what? I went and saw this nasty movie, whatever, but I can take it. You know? I can take it. I'm not going to get shocked. It's hard to shock me, right? What are we saying here? That shock is normal. Morbidity is normal. And not only that, but you need to be able to take it. And that makes you tough. That makes you someone that's admirable. It's hard to shock me. So what does that mean? Does that mean that if your neighbor gets murdered in front of your eyes, you should just take it and you shouldn't be shocked? This is really telling. How did this idea even, how does it even exist? Where did it come from? And yet, so we see that all of this has been seeping into our culture. And so, and the other thing is, for the few people that still are shocked about certain things, you'll see somebody tell them, oh, you know what? Come on, you need to be more open-minded to these things. In other words, open-minded to morbidity. But you never see people say, hey, let's be open-minded towards, you know, sitting at home and reading a book on history. Ugh. Nah. We're not going to be open-minded towards that. We're going to shut that out. But morbidity, open mind. Yeah. You need to, this is real life. You need to see it and immerse yourself in it and get used to it. Okay? Very interesting. So, and if you want an example, a recent example of this, there was a shooting. There was a sniper shooting. I forgot where it was. This was maybe like a year or two ago. And there were kids running around after the shooting, after it finished. There were kids running around filming the injured people on their phones instead of helping them. Okay? Point number 7. Self-preservation versus suicide. All societies in history preserve themselves or they die. Well, our society has now become suicidal. Right? All these poisonous ideas have taken hold coming from this new value system, and if you analyze them for a moment, you realize they all end in death. Let's run down the list. Abortion, death of infants. Okay, attacks on traditional families, whether it's divorce, the whole trans phenomenon, homosexuality, whatever it is, this is a form of sterilization, right? You're not going to have kids, so that's it. So in 100 years, everybody's dead. So it's a long-term suicide pact. We emphasize criminal rights. We don't talk about victims' rights. Been hearing this for 50 years. Unbelievable. So what does that mean? That means that innocent people get killed. And then, of course, we all get used to it because, we're tough and we can take it, right? Okay? Drugs. Okay? Just 4 examples there. Okay? All of this leads to death. Whose idea was this? This is the new value system. Wonderful. Okay? So, some more on this issue. There's a total war on parents and family. Okay? In our culture nowadays, both parents work, kids are put in daycare, old people are put in old folks' homes. It used to not be like that. Kids were raised at home. Old people used to live at home. Things were much more united in the family. When there was a problem, we banded together and we solved it and we stuck through the hard times. Not anymore. Just hire somebody, pay somebody. Don't worry about loyalty to your family, right? Parents are universally portrayed as repressive to children. And if you say, well, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Well, how many people have had their kids go to school and then the school tells them, when your parents abuse you, make sure you call DCF, here's their number. Because, those parents, they're abusive. They're gonna infringe on your individual freedoms. And when they do, make sure you call DCF, Department of Children and Families, so they can take you away from your family. But they never talk about the abuses that happen in foster homes that are under DCF. That you don't hear about, right? That's not emphasized, okay? Divorce has been normalized, right? Everybody knows a huge percentage of divorces, and it's considered normal, right? Never mind what happens to the kids. The kids belong to both parents. Now their hearts are broken. We don't talk about those things, okay? Finally, we talked a little bit ago about the battle of the sexes. So here's an interesting story for you. In football, American football, there's a Super Bowl. And every year there's a winner of the Super Bowl. A reporter goes into the winning locker room and he goes to the star player, usually the quarterback, and he said, hey, Mr. MVP, you were great today. You did this, you did that, you did the other. You're amazing. You're the MVP. And what does the quarterback, or what does the MVP say? Every year they all say the same thing. What do they say? It wasn't just me. It was the team. The team is what matters. The team is what got us here. The team is the reason we won the Super Bowl. It wasn't just me. Okay? Why am I talking about football now? Because this is what a team ethic looks like. In football, there's no equality, right? Offensive linemen don't get glory, right? The quarterback gets it, or the running back, or the wide receivers, right? Yet, who complains about that? So we understand the team ethic in football, but we don't understand it when it comes to families. Because when it comes to families, now it's all about, hey, Mrs. Wife, make sure your husband doesn't, abuse you, because you know how those men are. And then they go to the husband and say, be careful with those wives, because you know how they are, right? And so now everything has to be equal, right? If you wash 50 dishes, make sure she washes 50 dishes. Otherwise, you're getting abused. What would happen to a football team if we did this? Right? The offensive lineman would insist on scoring as many touchdowns as the quarterback. What would that do to the game? It would completely destroy everything. And this is what we've done. We've destroyed the family ethic, the family unit. The football team's okay, the family's not. Okay? Point number 8, hope versus hopelessness. America was a place of hope. I saw it when I came here. Again, these 2 eyes. I saw it. My parents saw it. My parents lived it. We all lived it. Okay, but nowadays, America's in decline. We can't do anything about it. Right? That's the predominant thought. When Trump was elected in 2016, he talked about bringing all these jobs back. And Obama came out and made a comment and he said, oh, what are you going to do, Donald? You're going to take out a magic wand and wave it around and create jobs? Okay? So now, apparently, we need magic in order to create jobs. This is how hopeless the situation is. Which is complete nonsense. right? A couple of right policies and that's it. The jobs will flow right back in. But no, we were being pushed. We were being sold a bill of hopelessness. Of America's in decline. That's it. We're done. Okay? We sent out entire industries, millions of jobs. We went out to foreign countries, started stupid wars that have no end, that had no benefit to us. We had terror attacks at home. Think about 9/11. And after 9/11, we couldn't even criticize the Muslims who did it. If you criticized them, they immediately jumped on you, right? Even though all the terrorists were Muslim. You couldn't criticize them. So this causes an aura of hopelessness. We're being attacked. We're being impoverished. And we can't even, forget fight back. We can't even mention it. We can't even criticize anything. Forget fight back. Okay? Hopelessness. Crime, drug use proliferating. The medical industry full of lies. Okay? Everybody getting sick. Nobody knows what's going on. Think about the COVID pandemic. All the hopelessness that caused. All the frustration. Nobody knew what was happening. We were being forced to do all these things. Now it's all coming to light. A lot of it was bullshit. Well, here we are. Okay, and of course, inflation constantly eating away our wealth to the point now where the American dream is considered dead. Okay? Point number 9. We used to be a nation of self-sacrifice. People would sacrifice for their country, for their families. Now it's all about selfishness and narcissism. Right? So kids never grow up. Right? When you're a kid, you're selfish. You're supposed to be. You're developing yourself. It's all about you. So you take. During your childhood phase, you're constantly taking. You take food, money from your parents. You take resources. You take lessons. You go to school. You learn things. You're constantly on the intake. When you become an adult, there gets a point where you have to start giving. Because for someone to take, someone else has to give. But nowadays, everyone just wants to take. It doesn't work that way. If no one gives, then everybody just takes, and the place becomes just an absolute ruin. So, where does a midlife crisis come from? This is where it comes from. We're getting old. We don't want to be old. We want to stay young. We want to be kids. Let's go have plastic surgery, right? Let's go buy toys. Let's go buy a sports car when I'm 45 because I want to pretend like I'm young. I want to divorce my old wife who gave me 20 years of 20 of her best years. I want to go get a trophy wife. Okay, we even have a term for this, trophy wife. This is how often it happens. Okay? So all of this, okay, has just completely, turned America on its head from self-sacrifice to selfishness. Point number 10, unity versus division. Okay? We used to be united in spite of our differences. And sure, there was a lot of fighting, there was a lot of conflict. Yeah, there were a lot of racists. There was a lot of, slurs and insults back and forth. But the country as a whole moved forward. People kept working. People kept doing. And that's the point. It's not that it was perfect, but it's that it worked. Nowadays, things don't even work. Now, our values are dividing us. And the internet echo chambers are making it a lot worse. Because now, not only are people not talking to the other side, now they don't even know that they exist. And then when you find out in the real world later on, like when some president gets elected that doesn't think like you, all of a sudden half the country is just, goes catatonic. They're just like completely shocked and they want to go out and start committing violence because they're so shocked. Okay, this didn't exist before. All right, not at this level. You see things like distrust between neighbors. In the old days, your neighbors could actually criticize you. Like your neighbor's parents, if they saw you do something bad on the street, they would chastise you for it. And they'd go tell your parents, and the parents would unify to raise the kids properly. Now, if you do that, now the parents start fighting. Same thing with teachers, right? Touch my kid and I'll sue. Don't discipline my kid, right? I'll do that at home, and then they don't discipline him at home either, right? So all this division, this was not that way, and this has completely changed. And of course, we talked about a couple episodes ago about how they remove the concept of truth. If there's no truth, there's nothing to unite us. If there's no external truth that we all share, that we're all pursuing, there's nothing to unite us. So by default, you start to get division. And of course, we mentioned earlier about no debates. Well, guess what? If there's no debates, there's no resolving of differences. So there's no unification. And finally, the last point, patriotism versus globalism. Okay, this was pretty obvious. How many people have desecrated the American flag? They don't care what it means. They don't care how many people died for it. They don't respect the symbolism of it. They start going after all these foreign ideas, all these globalist dreams, these things like climate change and I don't know, whatever other crazy ideas. And instead of taking care of your own house, you have all these grandiose ideas about the world, which of course feeds into your narcissism and all this virtue signaling that you see nowadays, that people are like, oh yeah, I'm so great because look, I'm saving the world, right? When in reality, you can't even clean your own bedroom, right? So our country's a disaster, but hey, we're taking care of the world, right? It's all a fantasy, but this is what we've been sold. We've been sold this bill of goods, and now here we are in this economic disaster. So those are the 11 points. So we've gone on for a while here, so I'll just end it real quick with two more things. Number one, if you're watching this and you hate this country, know that it's because you listen to our enemies. Okay? You did not study the truth of what's actually going on in this world. Go out and look at other countries and what goes on, and you'll see what's really happening. And then compare it to this, okay? So you listen to our enemies. And our enemies, of course, they wanted to destroy the U.S. because those mafias in the other countries, they know that if the U.S. model spreads throughout the world, they're finished. So it's either destroy the U.S. or even better, let's turn the U.S. into a global mafia that we can all unite around. And this is what they're doing. Okay? And if you hate the U.S., you're helping them do that. Okay? And finally, just know that we are now in the advanced stages of the attack. Right? This started in the 1960s. That's 60 years ago, folks. Okay? This has been going on for a long time. So we're in the advanced stages. We see large parts of our society have fallen prey to this. We can't talk to the other side. Okay? And we're going to talk next episode about all this division, why it exists and what we can do about it. But, we've been divided like never before. And we see a lot of people that are completely brainwashed into accepting whatever they're told. We saw this in a very obvious way in the COVID pandemic. People just did as they were told. Nobody questioned orders, and now that we're questioning them, we're realizing, wait a minute, something is off here. Yet everybody was just following it. So we're seeing that, which really didn't exist before. Okay, people were a lot more independent-minded. And so what's the next stage? Well, the stage has been set now for a civil war. And if we're not careful, this is where we're going to end up. And we can already see it. It's just about there. Okay? We've seen Antifa. Now we're seeing the Groypers. What are these? Okay? Communist youth, Hitler youth. That's it. And so now it's very simple. The stage has been set. The fighting could start at any time. Okay? So if we don't get a hold of this, and if we don't get our bearings, we're going to be in deep trouble. So that's it. Sorry, I don't have better news, folks. That's how I see it. And next episode, we're going to talk about all this division. We're going to sort of go deeper into it, what really causes it, and how we can get out of it. So America was a great place. It has fallen very far, quite rapidly. But let's see if we can get out of this somehow. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.